Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has expressed extreme concern over human rights abuses in India-occupied and annexed Kashmir and asked the Indian authorities to fully restore human rights in the occupied territory. In a statement on Tuesday, UNHCR spokesperson Rupert Colville said that the international human rights body is extremely concerned that the population of India-occupied Kashmir continues to be deprived of a wide range of human rights, and we urge the Indian authorities to unlock the situation and fully restore the rights that are currently being denied. Meanwhile, the lockdown in IOJK continues. The economy has been badly hit. Tourism, on which the local economy is largely dependent, has come to an end. The Indian authorities had, through an executive order in the run-up to the 5th August decision, removed all tourists from the occupied territory. Heavy deployment of security forces remains in place. While this goes on in IOJK, separatist leaders in the restive state of Manipur in India's northeast have declared independence from India, established a government in exile in London. Here's what they said in London.
The people of the state and the State Council firmly stand against the illegal occupation of Manipur by the Indian government and are determined to protect the territorial integrity of the state and uphold the independent sovereignty of the state.
Many draconian laws of India are operating in Manipur under the Republic Constitution of India, including Armed Forces Special Powers Act 1958, and killing many innocent people by the violation of human rights since the occupation of Manipur.
So India is now riven by various restive populations, people who do not want to be part of Indian Union. Pakistan has, of course, no formal position on what has happened in Manipur because in the event of what happens there, since that is accepted Indian territory, Pakistan does not really offer an official comment on that. However, that is where the difference with Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir lies, because that is a disputed region and territory, and that is a dispute recognized by the United Nations Security Council through its resolutions. Anyway, to discuss these developments, we are joined by Dr. Mohammad Faisal, who is the official spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, the chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global, who lives permanently in exile in London. Let me begin with Dr. Faisal. Dr. Faisal, thank you for being on the program. Let's begin with the Indian-occupied Kashmir situation. This is the report that I read out from some excerpts. And of course, the fact that India also took some of the members of European Parliament, 1/3 of which actually belong to far-right parties in Europe. But even that PR exercise did not really go very well.
It did not. And even domestically, Indian government is facing a huge backlash on this attempt that they made to somehow try to portray an element of normalcy, quote-unquote normalcy, in occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The problem is that the Indian government, the right-wing Hindutva government, has taken India into a closed street. There are no ways out of it, and now they are at a loss on how to wriggle out of this situation because the human rights clampdown can't really continue. It has to be lifted at certain point in time. And the fear that the Indian government has is that whenever it's lifted, there'll be a huge backlash, and that is what they want to avoid. We have been highlighting the situation at all forums. You would remember the Prime Minister's speech at UN General Assembly. It is effectively being raised in the OIC, in the Human Rights Council, elsewhere, everywhere. And it is becoming serious by the day for the Indians. The hearings in the US Congress, even whatever is happening within the EU and EU Parliament is very difficult situation for the Indians now. and things coming out of what Rahul Gandhi is saying, Mehbooba Mufti, all the people there. So they don't have a strategy to come out of it, whatever they have done. A short-sighted decision, and now they are in a fix.
Okay, thank you for pointing this out. Let me just, before I get back to you, Dr. Faisal, with the next question, here's something that I want to put on record. According to the UN Human Rights Commissioner's statement, hundreds of political and civil society leaders, including 3 former chief ministers of the occupied Jammu and Kashmir, have been detained on a preventive basis. While some political workers have reportedly been released, most senior leaders, especially those from the occupied Kashmir Valley, remain in detention. Now, Dr. Faisal, I mentioned the Manipur separatist unilateral declaration of independence and establishing a government in exile. That's a very smart step to take in terms of, presenting the problem to the wider world. Do you think we should also work in relation to Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir in terms of creating, for the Kashmiris to create a government in exile and to essentially present, be in the forefront of this and present this problem to the wider world?
It's a very interesting question, Ejaz. I think I can say 2 things on it. One, I can't comment, as you earlier said, on Manipur, but I can say one thing, that the way the Indian leaders, the elders, were able to handle the tendencies of separatism within India, which are huge, and you are well aware of it, and I don't formally comment on it, but there was a lot of wisdom in what the senior leadership had been doing in the last 50 years. And now with the change of position, of course, they would be facing many problems, one of which is the one that you just mentioned. Again, the Indian government, the current government, is at a loss on how to go forward with that. On the government in exile, the situation in occupied Jammu and Kashmir and the Jammu and Kashmir dispute is at an advanced stage as per the UN Security Council resolutions, which give it a legal standing. A government of exile might have a value, might not have a value, but the case for Jammu and Kashmir rests as per the UN Security Council resolutions, and it is an obligation which the international community undertook in the 40s and 50s and passed 18 resolutions. 2 are UN CIP resolutions, 16 are UN Security Council resolutions, which in detail work out the steps on how to resolve Jammu and Kashmir dispute. So at the moment, we are working with the UN Security Council resolutions. If there are any other opportunities and options, they can definitely be considered subsequently. But at the moment, our case is internationally very, very strong, on strong legal footings, as India is experiencing now after the unilateral action, illegal action that they took on 5th of August. They are now realizing, and it is becoming quite obvious to them, that the international law on this is very different. It stands in the UN Security Council resolutions, and unilateral revocation by Indian government will not resolve the problem for them.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great explanation. But the reason for my asking this was that we know, and you are in the middle of all this. India has been trying to push the Kashmiris and the Kashmiri identity on the back burner, and trying to make this about alleged quote-unquote terrorism and Pakistan. Now, of course, Pakistan is a party to this dispute, but Kashmiris are central to this. One of the issues that the world needs to understand is that the problem of human rights and state oppression and suppression of the Kashmiris is directly linked to the Kashmiri resistance, which takes its strength from the fact that they have been denied their right to self-determination, and that is the central point. So my question with reference to Kashmiri government in exile had more to do with that, highlighting that. Of course, as far as the legal position is concerned, as you've explained earlier, that we are on a very strong ground. And frankly, India doesn't really have much of a legal position to begin with. But to try and circumvent the realpolitik of this, I thought that perhaps it would be interesting to discuss the idea of a government in exile.
It is an interesting idea, and in the academic domain needs to be explored and taken further. And if there is some merit to it academically, we can definitely discuss it subsequently. But one very important point that comes out of what you're saying, there definitely was a problem linking the lack of realization of right to self-determination and the Kashmiri resistance, because the international community was more involved into the human rights violations in isolation without linking them to the underlying cause. And the Indian steps have actually put that on the front burner now. Everyone is now discussing the reasons for this clampdown, for the human rights violation, for the resistance that has happened. And the reason, as we always say, the root cause is lack of the fulfillment of the commitment made by the international community, which said that the decision of Jammu and Kashmir should be as per the wishes of the Kashmiri people and the UN Security Council resolutions.
Let me, before I let you let go, Dr. Faisal, just taking advantage of your presence on the program, with reference to Kartarpur, Sahib, what are we looking at in terms of the opening of, now that the agreement has been signed? Are we inviting the diplomats and all that? How is that going to unfold?
The opening, as you're well aware, is on the 9th of November, inshallah. The first Jatha from the Indian side would come on the 9th of November. They will come in the morning, go back in the evening. Of course, there will be guests coming from all around the world, Sikh leaders, other Nanak Sevaks from all over the world, Canada, America, England, Europe, wherever the Nanak Sevaks, primarily Sikhs, are. They are welcome. They will come. The Prime Minister himself will inaugurate the event. It is a wonderful opportunity to overcome the problems that we have when we deal with India, and also a reflection of how Pakistan treats minorities both within its borders and how it wishes minorities to be treated elsewhere in the world. This is also in line with both primarily what our Prophet Nabi Pak Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has said about dealing with minorities, and in his footsteps what Qaid-e-Azam has said about the white part of the flag that we have. So you're well aware, Ejaz, and we talk about it always, that we are extra, we go the extra mile when dealing with the minorities. But sadly, one odd case that comes to the light, it brings the entire Pakistan into a bad light. The facts, as you know it and I know it, minorities are treated in a very special manner in Pakistan, and this is a manifestation of our treatment of minorities, the Kartarpur Sahib corridor. It was a very difficult negotiating with a country with which you have fought 4 wars, and signing a document, I think, after 30 or 40 years. It was a huge thing, and luckily we were able to do it, thank God.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was Mohammed Faisal speaking with us. Let me hop over to Mr. Qureshi here. Mr. Qureshi, going back to Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, as I said, you live in London in exile, obviously, because there is so much state repression. Now, they have reportedly relaxed some of the restrictions in the Jammu region and also in the Ladakh region, but the valley still remains under lockdown. What are the latest reports from there?
Thank you, Ejaz. The latest information that we are trying to get from within the valley, as I said, today there was obviously the inauguration and the appointment of the governors, both in Ladakh first and then in the valley itself. In terms of the telecommunication, the valley still mostly remains blocked. We're still unable to get through to the people through whether landlines or mobile phones in most of the valleys. Some of the areas within Srinagar have been, are open. There are telecommunications working around the airport sides of the things. I haven't been able to still get through my extended family for the last 87 days who live in Baramulla, who live in Sopore. I've tried to contact with other friends within the United Kingdom, again, who are finding it very difficult to get through to even the lines they claim to have opened. The schools still remain shut, and there was a forceful opening of the colleges yesterday after 3 months of a complete clampdown on curfew, with no colleges open to teach students about their syllabus. Yet They announced a massive examination starting from yesterday. And really, that was just a pure gimmick to project a normalcy in front of this unofficial 27 European Parliament members. It is becoming clear to the world, as Faisal mentioned, that this whole PR stunt that the Modi is trying to project to the world, that there is a normalcy in Kashmir and there's a development because of this abrogation of Article 370, is miserably failing. The world is realizing
absolutely.
what,
In fact, just to interject, it was really funny because some of these MEPs pointed out to the Indian government that, if you can invite us, why not the Indian opposition parties?
Absolutely. And even after the invitation, it was so projected as an unofficial invitation. Richard, who's a UK MEP from Manchester, requested that he be allowed to speak to the people, to the civilians, without any pressure. And he was completely denied. And his invitation was revoked. And that kind of shows the extent of the frustration and the miserably failure of the Modi government, the Hinduwata extremist government, who are trying to create a different narrative, how they're failing to win the hearts of the people and yet continuing the atrocities that they're committing in Kashmir. Yeah,
absolutely.
The delegation was taken to Dal Lake. There was a massive protest by the civilians trying to highlight the true picture of the Kashmir. The complete Dal Lake was shut down. Shops were closed, and we clearly heard it from Richard that there are thousands of human rights violations that the current government is committing in Kashmir, and the world needs to take a notice of that.
Let me ask you this question, Mr. Qureshi, with reference to a government in exile. And I gave the example of what has happened, what the Manipur separatist leaders have done. Do you think this is an idea that needs to be pursued?
I think one of the accepted facts that we have on the Kashmir issue, that it is recognized as an international dispute, not just by the international community, but by the United Nations. I think more than setting up a government in exile, what would help is that if the government of Pakistan, the people of Pakistan and Azad Kashmir actually played their role full, because they are a part to this dispute, an internationally recognized dispute. Unlike Manipur, which is not an internationally recognized dispute, who doesn't have a representation, for them it definitely makes sense to have that government in exile so that they can actually further their cause. But as far as the Kashmir dispute is concerned, it is a well-recognized since 1947 as the oldest dispute in the United Nations. But what we do lack is a forceful policy, a dedicated long-term policy from our stakeholder Pakistan, who's already been the only moral support we have on international level. Is we need a proactive diplomatic strategy, a long-term strategy that will ensure that the issue of Kashmir is highlighted and there are tangible steps that are taken. I'm not sure whether the government in exile would be beneficial that much because, as I said, it is an internationally recognized dispute. We just need to work harder and better and more focused to achieve the right of self-determination.
Okay, I have my own views, but since I am not an analyst on the program, but a moderator, I will not voice that. But give me a sense of what's happening with the economy in occupied Kashmir.
At the moment, the complete economy is shut down with only 1 or 2 hours that the shops remain open. There's been a loss of millions, $1.4 billion loss of trade. The people, the common people, are suffering. Around 60% of the population in the valley is dependent on a private source of income on the daily basis, daily wages. Millions are losing their income. They're unable to feed their families. They're unable to earn any money, whether that is through transportation career or through trade of fruits and vegetables. All these economical streams have been blocked, and it is affecting people considerably. Now, the estimation at the moment, as I said, is about $1.4 billion has been lost within the Kashmir trade.
Okay. Finally, what is happening in the health sector, especially with the hospitals? There was a problem with the supply of medicines, and of course, a number of other problems in terms of carrying patients from homes to hospitals and back and forth and the rest of it. How's that panning out?
Unfortunately, the situation is still the same. The hospitals are running out of the medication. Some of our volunteers that live in the valley try to actually get some aid from the other states of India. But again, there's a lot of challenge and there are a lot of blockades from within the valley set by the Indian government and Indian forces who are trying to prevent that aid going to the hospitals. There are people, we're getting reports of deaths happening every day because they're not getting basic medications such as the dialysis or COPD that is not reaching to them on time. So there is a huge humanitarian crisis, both food-wise, medication, as well as living standards that are decreasing in there. With the winter approaching, there's a lack of fuel for them. The winter fuel is not getting there. They don't. There hasn't been any preparation to store any burning wood for the people who are living in extreme far villages. With the severe winter being approaching, that is another crisis that will be starting to hit, and that's already started to hit the people of Kashmir.
That's another crisis. There are multiple crises in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, a disputed territory that India illegally annexed on 5th August. Thank you. That was Mr. Zaffar Qureshi speaking with us from London. We'll take a short break and return to discuss the protests that have racked Iraq and Lebanon. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Protests continue in Iraq. Tens of thousands of demonstrators have tried to swarm the Green Zone, the area in central Baghdad where Iraq's government and governing class lives. They've been met by Iraqi security forces and Iran-backed militias firing tear gas canisters and live ammunition. At least 240 people have been killed so far, and protests have spread to the city of Karbala. In Lebanon, political leaders who a few weeks ago enjoyed the local support of core followers despite worsening economic conditions are now the target of many of those people's ire. For instance, it was unthinkable only days ago for anyone to show a reverence towards Hassan Nasrallah, the powerful Hezbollah leader. He is now a target of ridicule, as is Nabi Berri, the powerful leader of Amal, who is also the Speaker of Parliament. Saad Hariri has already stepped down, but that hasn't cut with the protesters. There are specifics peculiar to the two countries, but there are also commonalities. Corrupt leaders must step down. The sectarian and ethnic political constitutional arrangements must go, replaced by responsible governments that actually work for the people instead of lining their own pockets and giving sinecures to their supporters. Is this Arab Spring 2.0? The last time we saw a groundswell of mass protests, it resulted in much violence but no real reforms. What are we looking at now? To discuss this, we are joined by Burton, who's a Middle East expert and joins us from Brussels. Leila Khatoum, who is a journalist and writer, joins us from Beirut. Let me go first to Mr. Burton here. Mr. Burton, I talked about, is this Arab Spring 2.0? The last time, as I said, we saw what happened didn't really result in much reforms. In fact, things might just have gotten worse in the countries where the Arab Spring began. What was the sense then, and how do you look at the situation now?
Well, I mean, when we look at what happened back in 2011 with the uprisings that started in Tunisia and then moved into Egypt, you saw a groundswell of enthusiasm and excitement. You mentioned the violence, but a lot of that was as a result of the governments actually responding and reacting to that. And so when we saw the first stumbling block in Libya, where the government made it very clear that they were not going to allow, the same thing to happen to them. They were not going to allow the government to be overthrown. And so they started to push back. So I think what you find, especially if you're comparing what's happening now, I think we have had nearly a decade of, pushing back and forth. But I think what's interesting that today compared to the past is this, very conscientious decision maybe on the parts of the protesters to not link up the protests. Not only have we seen them taking place in Iraq and Lebanon, but also earlier in the year we saw them happening in Sudan and Algeria. And of course, there are very specific reasons for these uprisings, these demonstrations and protests, much of it linked to economic frustration, the stagnation of the economy, the fact that there aren't very many jobs for young people coming through, and very poor public services. Those are the issues that sort of are underpinning all of this. But whereas before in 2011, there was this sense that, the protests were linked, that there was a sense of sort of Arabness and frustration across the region. Today, there's more of an emphasis on sort of dealing with, the issues within each country.
One of the things that I find interesting, Guy Burton, is that, in Lebanon also post the Taif agreement, said, well, we're going to have constitutional arrangements which will essentially configure power in ethnic and sectarian terms. And Iraq also more or less had the same kind of constitutional arrangement post the US troop withdrawal. But what we are witnessing now is that, in Lebanon also, in Iraq also, for instance, the Shiite population is rising up and essentially agitating against their own leaders. And it's the same thing with the Sunnis. So it seems to me that something interesting is happening there. How would you define that?
I mean, certainly, I would be very interested to hear our Lebanese colleague to discuss this a little bit as well from the context of Lebanon. But what is interesting, I think, is this sense that actually there is a disconnect opening up between the people on the one side and the political class on the other. There's a sense from the protesters that the political system doesn't represent them anymore, that it's broken, that these politicians, whoever they happen to be, are failing to, deliver a more sort of deliver effective or meaningful or quality public services on the one hand, and the ability to sort of get the economy going on the other. And so I think that is kind of what's really interesting about it, that there is this separation opening up between between the politicians and the public. And I think that's going to be a real question moving forward, because the issue for many with the protests at the moment are that they are effectively leaderless. And so, this then makes it very difficult. How can government engage and respond to a mass movement? On the other hand, there is an advantage for the government, because without any kind of clear leadership on the protesters' side, it makes it very easy for the government to effectively set the agenda and to move on.
Absolutely. Stay with me, Guy. Let me hop over to Leila here. Leila, same question to you. And also, do you agree with what Guy Burton is saying in terms of the kind of contradiction that has appeared between the people and the political ruling classes?
For the first time in Lebanon's history, actually, at one point or another, all factions together, not only the Shia, not only the Sunni, but also the Christians, took down to the streets. Not because there was a disconnect between the people and the government. Guy actually spoke about a disconnect. Maybe that's true in the case of Iraq. But in the case of Lebanon, there had been a disconnect for the longest time. People had been complaining about the lack of employment. We had a really high number of high percentage of youth unemployment in Lebanon that the government never tackled. For the past literally 6 governments, they always promised to tackle the issues of corruption, to tackle the issues of unemployment, to tackle issues of services. We don't even have basic services in Lebanon. This is how dire the situation is. And the promises come, the promises go, governments come and go, but nobody actually implements reforms. So by the time the government this time came together to actually talk about how to fix the financial and economic situation in Lebanon, they came up with a solution that actually angered the people, taxed the people. Instead of finding other solutions, they just imposed more taxes. And this is what made the people angry. And that's why they took to the streets. So it's not the disconnect, it's the fact that people are fed up with the lies. They can take it up to 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but for how long? No, enough is enough. And that's why we saw them.
Okay, Leila, so there is the economic side of this, obviously. Deprivation, poor infrastructure, poor governance and the rest of it. But there also seems to be another issue here, which is the constitutional compact, which, as I said, the Taif agreement essentially divided power among various ethnic and sectarian factions. It seems to me that the people want that system to go, that compact to go. Is that sense correct?
To a large extent, yes, it is correct. But the idea is that even before the Taif agreement came, we had the sectarian division. We had the 50-50 between the Christians and the Muslims. We had the Christian president, the Shiite parliament speaker, and the Sunni prime minister. The fact that the Taif came, it never changed that. It promised to change sectarianism into a civil government, but they actually kept the custom law, which is basically having a Christian president, Shiite parliament speaker, and a Sunni prime minister. Now, the people are calling for changing that regime, but not only like the sectarian regime, but also basically not only on the presidential level or the prime minister level, but also on the work level. You have the public works, the public servants, they are also divided 50-50 between Christians and Sunnis. So, Christians and Muslims. It's also divided among the Shiite, the Sunnis, the Druze, the Maronites, the Catholics, etc., the Greek Orthodox. People are fed up with basically having to go, and if you are actually competent to take a job, but you're not from the right sect, you can't take it. So the idea is that people are fed up with that. The Taif agreement kept it, and it said that until a new parliament that's elected based on a just electoral law that would wipe out sectarianism, people should keep the sectarian regime until then. So it fixed nothing.
Okay, this is Guy Burton. This seems to me like a very interesting point in the sense that the U.S. also blessed this as an occupation force, the Iraqi constitutional arrangement. That is like a wedding of the traditional to sort of modern constitutional compact. The thought behind this would be that since there are these divisions and since they cannot really be wished away, so instead of the fault lines increasing, let's give a share of the pie to everyone. But now it appears that this arrangement is not really working.
Yeah, and I mean, if we look at the case of Iraq, for example, as you precisely pointed out, after 2003, the Americans introduced a highly sectarianized system with elections, which effectively those who are identify with those particular communities, made their political picture related to that, especially when you're working within a context in which there is very little opportunity, the economy is weak, there's very few sort of, forms of national identity. Those who exploited sectarian differences or sort of ethnic differences, took advantage. I'd just like to say as well, to commenting on what Leila said, she's absolutely right that that there were very specific reasons for the protests to take place in Lebanon. In fact, and it's not just that they've been going on right now. I mean, there's been going on at regular occasions over the past decade and a bit. In fact, one of the things that we forget is that there was quite a bit of protest and demonstrations going on before 2011 and before sort of, I guess, the Arab Spring gave us this kind of framework in which we think about protesters happening. But certainly there were occasions, moments when this happened. What the frustrating thing is that governments haven't been able to respond to this. Even since at least over a decade now, the United Nations has put out several reports which have talked about the need for governments to reform, to address major changes, to revitalize the economies, to provide better public services, to provide better opportunities for their people. This is not a new phenomenon. This is an ongoing situation in the Middle East.
It's an ongoing question. Leila, one of the things in the political science literature, comparative politics, we look at factions and we say, okay, so if factions is where the politicians are going to draw their strength, then that's a template they won't want to break. Now, what the people are demanding, of course, it seems to me, as I said earlier, that they want to break this template. But for instance, in the case of Lebanon, while people were protesting against Nabi Berri, according to an Al Jazeera report, said that he's basically sided with the crowds. And he said, well, they're demanding what Amal has been demanding for a very long time. So it seems that he wants to retain his relevance there. Is that the sense that you also get, that the current politicians will, at some point, in order to retain the factional strength that they have, give up, some of the power and give in to some of the demands? Or do you think the crowds are not going to accept anything less than a complete rearrangement of the deck?
Well, first of all, let me just comment on what Nabih Berri actually said, the parliament speaker. The parliament speaker and the prime minister both said that they had been trying their best and they want the same demands as the people. But they are the root cause of the problems that the people, they are demanding that they leave the power. These people have been accused of corruption for not only a decade, but more than that. Hariri actually, he inherited power from his father. But the problem goes to Nabih Berri, who had been in power since 1992. So the problem with that is basically this guy hasn't changed anything since 1992. He has a large faction. He has his own hooligans who went down on the ground and they beat up people yesterday during the protests. Everybody, the whole world saw it. It's just because he's discontent with people trying to remove him. But then he goes out to the foreign media and he says, look, I want the same demands as people. People were laughing at what he said. People were laughing at what Saad al-Hariri said because everybody's portraying himself as a victim here. So apparently they are the victims and everybody else is to blame except for themselves. But they have been in power for ages, and that's the problem. For me, at this point, people are fed up. They want more change. They have been demanding more reforms. So we have to wait and see what the president has to say tonight, because the president had asked the people to present a paper of demands from some of the protesters or the leaders among the protesters, but there are no leaders. That's the problem. I myself had went down across Lebanon and spoke to people on the ground on their demands. I have compiled some of those demands and I have sent it to the president this morning. So we're waiting on that as well.
So the South seems to be even more vocal than the North, and that's an interesting phenomenon.
It's more vocal because this is the South is majorly dominated by Shiite population. You do have Christians and Druze as well, and Sunnis, but it's mainly Shia dominated. It's the power, it's the stronghold of Hezbollah and Amal movement. And for the first time in Lebanon's history, the Shiite community revolts against its dual parties. There are only two parties, Shiite parties, that are strong enough on the ground, who have their own hooligans, they have their own arms. And that's Amal movement and Hezbollah, actually Hezbollah more than Amal movement. And people had lived in fear at one point or in awe for what the resistance had done at one point, but they never put on reforms on the ground. They kept dividing the power among themselves until people were fed up. So this is the first time that we see the Shia revolt against that dual parties. And basically everybody just went in tow. I do believe if the Shia stop revolting on the ground, basically the revolution would just die, because not everybody else has the same zeal.
Okay. Guy Burton, if the principal contradiction is now between the people, the populations, and the ruling classes, and the ruling classes subsume all the various sectarian and ethnic fault lines that we talked about and which are reflected in the Constitution, then we are actually looking at protests that are kind of leaderless. But in order for them, for a proper political course of action, they probably have to work out a leadership on the trot. Would you agree with that?
I mean, one of the, as you point out, how do these movements sort of coalesce to basically provide some kind of organization and some clear set of demands? I mean, I guess we're at sort of a quite fluid stage in the case of Lebanon and Iraq at the moment. But if we look at sort of cases that I alluded to that have happened earlier in the year, I mean, Sudan, major demonstrations started there in November, December last year and continued with the overthrow of the president in April. A backlash by the military who were in control of the regime in June. And in August, what we had there was an agreement signed between the military part of the regime with the civilians. The idea being that over 3 years there should be a transition towards elections. On the civilian side, that included a quite wide-ranging coalition of social movements, trade unions, professional associations, and others. The big challenge is, of course, going to be to make sure that the regime sort of follows through on what's supposed to be delivered. So I think similar things are going to sort of probably have to happen when you're looking at the case of Lebanon and Iraq. Obviously you will find that the political parties themselves will try to claim the protests as their own, and will try to take ownership of them. Of course, the challenge will be from the demonstrators to make it clear that they are not necessarily speaking on their behalf.
Okay. Guy Burton, another interesting angle to all this is the Iran factor. Now, people, the protesters find that they are at the business end of the guns of Iranian-backed militias. So, and the Iranian supreme leader has already said that it's the U.S. that is fishing in troubled waters. But the reports emerging from Iraq obviously point to a different kind of problem there. So how do, in terms of Iran's influence within Iraq, how do you think the protests are going to impact that?
Yeah, I mean, for the Iraqi government at the moment, it finds itself sort of caught between two sides. On the one hand, obviously, the Iranians have significant political influence, partly through sort of the sectarianism that exists with a large Shia Shia majority in Iraq, and obviously that sort of manifested in the political system, as we talked about before. On the other hand, the Iraqi government wants to sort of maintain a good relationship with the United States. And of course, it's being caught in the middle by, the growing tensions that have taken place over the last 6 to 7 months between the United States and Iran. So the government finds itself in a very awkward situation there. I mean, just to sort of, if I could just push it a little bit further, we've talked a little bit about sort of the relationship between, sort of the governments and the political class on the one side and the protesters on the other. There is, of course, the sort of the wider, international actors that need to be taken into consideration. And so we've talked a little bit about the Iranians, but of course, there are sort of the role of others who have, they've responded in the last 7 or 8 years since the Arab Spring by taking a much more, they've sought a situation in which they want to try and persuade, governments to sort of take to establish stability. They've sort of encouraged regimes
in order to avoid any further upheavals. Thank you so much, Guy Burton, speaking with us. Leila, back to you quickly before I wrap up, and I have very little time. How are you looking at the situation in the next, let's say, a few days, a week?
Well, in the next we're not going to see much in the next few days. It's a give and take. People have wains on the streets at the moment. They're waiting for what the president has to say. They're waiting to see if there's going to be reforms implemented or not. At the same time, you had the Christian factions in Lebanon ordering their own people to go on the ground, and they are trying to settle their own tight political problems. And that's why basically on the Christian side, it hasn't been that strong compared to the Muslim side in the country. How I see it, it's going to be another basically a long American movie. It's a Hollywood movie, literally. You just have to sit back and relax and see how things will progress in Lebanon.
Okay, it's going to be another Hollywood flick. Thank you so much, Leila Khatoum, speaking with us on what's happening in Lebanon. This is all for tonight from Indus Special. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.